I'm Corey Strumman. Welcome to the Rochester Rising podcast, where we amplify the stories of entrepreneurs in Rochester, Minnesota. Thank you for spending some time with us today to learn more about small business and the culture of entrepreneurship in Rochester. We hope that you learned something today from a local entrepreneur that can help you with your own journey. Rochester Rising is a part of Collider, a Rochester-based nonprofit that activates, connects, and empowers early-stage entrepreneurs in the community. You can learn more about Collider and how our organization can help accelerate and assist your journey at collider.mn. Today on the podcast, we chat with Levi Sauerbrei about his technology assistance service, Nerd Butler. Let's get started. Well, hello, Levi. Thank you so much for being on with me today.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Well, to get started, tell me a little bit about you. What are some of your hobbies and interests outside of work?
Oh, goodness. So I'm a nerd by vocation and avocation. So most of my hobbies involve something to do with technology, teaching myself new stuff. I have a dog, so there's a lot of frisbee fetching involved.
Love that.
Occasionally shoveling a sidewalk here and there. No cooking or anything like that. I'm not particularly domestic, but I do a lot of laundry. And if all of this sounds like, sort of the entrepreneur story of there's not a lot of distinction between personal and professional life, that's sort of where we ended up after a while.
That's true. Yeah. Well, what kind of brought you to the Rochester area and what keeps you around?
Yeah. So we've been in and out of Rochester for a couple of years now. My in-laws are here. My mother-in-law for a few years was receiving treatment at Mayo.
Okay.
Liked it so much that she relocated. And so we would come up here for holidays and in the summer when it's beautiful, and then we'd come up for just enough of the winter to have the holiday experience, and then we would go back to Texas. But as my in-laws spent more time here and we really got to like the city, we decided to relocate here. And now we're staying because I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in Iowa as a younger kid, and so it feels very much like coming home to me. Mm-hmm. My in-laws and my wife are all from Louisiana, so it feels like an exotic and interesting place to them. So everybody's very happy with that.
Very nice. Did you start your business in Rochester, or was that in the works before you got here?
No, I actually started Nerd Butler in Texas probably 6 years ago or so, and I ran it as a consulting agency for a while, and then my wife's company got big enough and complicated enough that she basically hired me as her full-time CTO and put me on her staff. And I dropped on. She was my only client, I guess is the best way to say that.
Sure.
And coming back to Rochester, we had sold that company. And so I found myself with a lot of extra hours in the day, and you can only do the dishes so many times. And I was really coming back to Rochester, which is a smaller community than Dallas. I really wanted to find a way to contribute to the community and to try out some of these ideas that have been bubbling through my head over the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. Did the transition to Rochester and kind of entering this community provide any unique challenges in kind of restarting your business or revamping your business in a different place?
I don't know about challenges. It's been, I think, like I said, coming from the Dallas area where obviously that's a huge business hub. There's a lot of money to be made in Dallas. There's a lot of money floating around Dallas. Everything's bigger in Texas. But from an entrepreneurial standpoint, like it feels a little bit like New York. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere.
Sure.
So in Dallas, the barrier to entry for a new business owner is significantly higher in that you have to have, we always bootstrap things. We never look for funding. But even then, like getting meetings, figuring out what meetings you should be trying to get, all of that was, significantly more complex in the Dallas area than it is in Rochester. And frankly, the entrepreneurial community in Minnesota and Rochester in particular has been so amazing that like it's night and day. So it's been really great to come here and sort of start getting involved with that group.
Yeah, for sure. What is your background in work and education?
Yeah, I got my first computer when I was 12, and my dad handed me all the manuals that went with it. This is back when we had printed manuals, and he said, if I have any questions, I'm asking you. So I started there and just found it fascinating, so I kept training myself. After high school, I went into the Air Force and got a degree in electronics and worked on wireless communications like police band radios, air traffic control radios for the military. I got out of that and went to college and studied electrical engineering for a while and then computer science for a while. And in all of those endeavors, I would get to some point in the curriculum where we're talking about ones and zeros now, like quite literally ones and zeros. And I would say, that's not interesting enough to me to spend 20 hours in the lab figuring it out.
Sure.
So I ended up in the psychology program because that was way more interesting. And I eventually got an information systems degree. But through all of that experience, it taught me that the place I want to fit in that puzzle is helping people understand and use computers or technology of any kind, right? So it always made sense to me, and for a long time I couldn't, the psychology part really taught me why it didn't make sense to other people, right? We all have you have a different thought process, or you're a visual learner instead of a different type of learner. And then trying to work on translating. Software engineers are really, really smart. They're not always plugged into the thought patterns of the people who are going to use their tools.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So trying to bridge that gap between the users and the engineers.
Yeah, absolutely. While you were first getting Nerd Butler started, what would you say were some of the biggest barriers that you faced or challenges?
I was very fortunate in that I married an entrepreneur. So the sort of blocking and tackling of setting up a business, getting an EIN number, filing the LLC, all of that stuff was pretty old hat to her. And she just said, do this, do this, do this. She already had a bookkeeper and a CPA. She's a marketing person. So I had a bit of a head start on all of those types of things. I think the biggest challenge for me is translating that passion I had for sort of a very broad concept of helping people with technology, as I put the air quotes around that sentence, and trying to hone it into a concept that can be quickly communicated and focused enough. That's not helping people with technology is not a product or a service, really.
Sure.
It's a concept, right? So going from concept to product is still the thing I spend most of my time on, is trying to dial in the most efficient way to help to accomplish that concept.
Sure. So what is your client experience like? What should people expect when they're utilizing your services?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is I want people to have an understanding at the end of the process. If it's the installation of a television, to take a really simple example, okay, we're going to put the TV mount on the wall. You don't need to know how to do that because it's only going to happen once. We're going to hang the TV on the television mount. Again, it's only going to happen once. The owner of the TV doesn't really care how that happens. But after that, when you push the power button on the television and the first screen on the TV comes up, it can be intimidating, or it can be, you've never had this brand of TV before. I've worked with lots of family members, older family members in particular, like, what do you mean it's a smart TV? What makes it smart?
Sure.
Right? Why is there a Netflix button on my remote control? So working with Nerd Butler, whether it's as a consumer or as a business, that understanding of how to use the tools you've already spent your money on is a really big piece of that puzzle. For lots of small business owners, they don't have a website yet, or they don't have their email set up yet. And so if we're going to build a website for that company, at the end of that process, the owner or whoever their designated contact is will know how to log into the website, how to make basic updates to the website, how to add a new employee to the email setup, right? So not trying to lock them into my services on an ongoing basis. If they decide they don't want to do business with me, if something happens to me or my company, if we relocate, like whatever, there's a million reasons why I might not be the professional providing you that service in the future.
Sure.
You need to have all the keys to the kingdom, and you need to have enough knowledge to do basic things and to communicate with the next person that comes in.
So empowering people to kind of
absolutely
do it for themselves.
Too many small businesses I met, they knew a guy who set up their website for them.
Right.
But the guy is the one that has to log in for the GoDaddy account. And so they can never, ever, ever again update their website, because GoDaddy will not like it wasn't set up under the business's name. It was set up under this email address, which I no longer have access to.
Sure.
There is no proof of ownership you can provide to them that will let them hand it over to you. So
Right.
that ownership and that control and that understanding is really, really critical.
Yeah, that's huge. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you participated in the Co-Starters program this year?
Not the first cohort. I am signed up for the second cohort.
Okay,
which
very
starts
cool.
at the
Very
end of
cool.
January. Yeah.
Very exciting.
Yeah,
We're
I'm looking
excited to
forward to
have
it.
you. Yeah, wonderful. Did you find that the pandemic affected your business in any way?
It affected all of our businesses. I'm trying to think what we were doing at the beginning of the pandemic because it was so long ago. During the pandemic, my wife got inspired to start a new company, which took up a bunch of our time, getting things up and running. As a technology person, it didn't affect my clientele as much. Things got really static there for a while,
Sure.
but watching the whole world, like entire school districts go remote, watching entire companies suddenly and forcefully go remote has been really fascinating. And I think it's a net benefit in the sense that the general population has a broader tool set now.
Sure.
Zoom is a verb, and it wasn't before. Video conferencing, I think, before the pandemic was something that really intimidated a lot of people.
Yeah.
And because we've been forced to, video conferencing no longer intimidates most people. Even, grandparents who were forced to FaceTime with their grandchildren because they couldn't see them. Certainly in a business environment, it to me, it's broadened everyone's knowledge of some of these things. And so in the technology space, I think it's changed how an IT department, how employees and how employers all interact with your physical presence in the office.
Absolutely.
IT security obviously was a big one that, people had to suddenly figure out a better answer for. They were structured to only have 5% of, the traveling sales force was the only remote employees in the company before. And so having that little network connection for them was great, but suddenly there was 2,000 people that were trying to access the VPN at the same time. And so a lot of things shifted around, but I think ultimately for the better on the IT side.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you find most rewarding about your work?
Oh, goodness. I guess two things. Usually at the beginning of an engagement, the most rewarding thing is when, a customer tells me what the problem is, and typically you only get to them when they're really frustrated, right? They think they should be able to figure it out themselves. Obviously, they were told they could, like you can buy it off the shelf and it's got instructions and, but at the beginning of the engagement, it's listening to that and then saying, okay, something actually is wrong and you're not an idiot. Right. Which is that's their concern, right? Like, I'm going to feel really dumb soliciting outside help for something that everybody can do anyway. And at the end of the engagement, like I said, it goes back to that thing about empowerment. It's walking out of the room and knowing that even if they choose never to use that information for anything, they understand a little more about what's happening when they push that button or when they turn on that device. Because the thing that people forget is I think we overlook how much all of this stuff affects us every day. It's your doctor's appointment. It's your dentist appointment. It's the school district. It's everything. I say a lot of times I'll tell people, like, every company is an IT company now. It's not just that you have IT resources. It's like, unless you're in construction or but even in construction, you have technology that you're using on a daily basis at every level of that organization, whether it's, even just walkie-talkies or communication devices. So every company is an IT company. And folks that, I've worked with lots of, it's a generational thing to a certain extent, but not always, who are like, I just want to do my job. I don't want to have to use the computer. And that's like saying, I want to be a carpenter, but I don't want to use hammers, right?
Right, yeah.
So leaving an engagement and knowing that they now feel more in charge of the tools that they're using and not the other way around, right? The technology shouldn't control how we do things. We should decide how we want to do things and then find the technology that makes that happen.
Yeah, absolutely. What's a piece of advice you would give to somebody considering starting a business?
I think what I mentioned before is like you typically will start a business in something you're super passionate about. There are people who, and there's nothing wrong with this, who go into the financial sector, for instance, and
Sure.
like my passion is to make more money. Like, great, that's a worthy ambition. But you're probably going to start a business around your passion, and the quicker you can figure out how to transition yourself from that concept to that product, like you hear the phrase niche down, like get as specific as possible. And that sounds really easy to do, but then as soon as you start trying to do it, it's like, okay, I want to open a pastry shop. Well, that might not be small enough. Okay, I want to open a cupcake shop. Okay, I want to open a wedding cupcake shop, right? And the more specific you can be, it's much easier from a marketing standpoint, from a business plan standpoint. It's much easier to broaden that later than it is to focus in once you're already rolling and trying to cover the bills and trying to figure out who to hire. And like, the more specific you are at the start, with both with your goals and with your offerings, whether it's a product or a service, I think the easier it's going to be.
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you for your insights into Nerd Butler and for the conversation.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Levi for sharing his story. You can learn more about Nerd Butler by clicking the link in our show notes. And thank you for tuning into the podcast today. We are so appreciative of your time spent listening and of your support of our work here at Collider. If you know an entrepreneur who would benefit from the conversation today, please share this podcast with them so that they can benefit from the experience of other business owners in the community. We launched Rochester Rising in 2016 to tell stories of entrepreneurship taking place within the city of Rochester, especially stories that otherwise would not have been told, and to take the time to understand each entrepreneur and what their experience has been like in the community. If you find value in this podcast, please consider donating and lending support to Collider's efforts to share the stories of Rochester entrepreneurs and inspire others on their journey. You can find more information about our tip jar and how to donate in our show notes. Thanks again for tuning into the Rochester Rising podcast.